The archive was supposed to be empty. That was the whole point of Marat Asen's filing system. The man had spent 11 years building a bureaucratic structure so deliberately mundane, so perfectly inert in appearance, that no one would look twice at it. Folder after folder of cargo manifests, transit route approvals, stamped and countersigned, hull inspection certificates going back to 2247. I had spent 3 weeks sifting through his professional records after the Threni Transit Authority declared his shuttle lost in a navigational anomaly, and I had found exactly what I expected to find: the meticulous documentation of a man who had done his job for a long time and done it carefully, and bequeathed a very clean desk to whoever came after him. The hidden partition was behind a scheduling subfolder labeled Contingency, unassigned. Not clever, not dramatic, just the word contingency in a folder tree no one would ever open unless they were reorganizing the filing structure for archival handoff, which is exactly what I was doing when I found it. I remember sitting back in my chair. The outer office of the Arbiters Coordination Bureau on Selin Station was empty that afternoon. The supply freighter that usually ran noise through the loading dock was late, and the corridor outside was quiet enough that I could hear the environmental system cycling. The timestamp on the partition said it had last been written to 14 months before Marat's shuttle went down. I opened it. I want to be precise about what I saw, because the order in which it lands matters. The first file was a text document titled Record. It was 41 pages. The second through the 468th files were data packages, each one containing a name, a date, a transit route identifier, and an incident report sourced from Threni Syndicate internal communications. Communications Marat Asen had been intercepting and decrypting for the better part of a decade. I read the first page of the record document. Then I locked the workstation, stood up, walked to the equipment locker at the back of the office, removed the portable hard drive I kept there for field deployments, and copied the entire partition to it. Then I went to find Commander Petra Solvings, who was the ranking bureau officer on the station, and who I had never spoken to about anything more significant than duty roster adjustments. I told her I had found something, and that she needed to sit down. She sat down. I put the drive on the table between us and I said, "I think Marat knew he was going to die." The outer corridor is not a romantic place. I want to be clear about that before I describe what was done there, because the tendency when you talk about the corridor is to reach for frontier language, wilderness language, a vast and lawless stretch of lanes between human licensed space and the trade node networks of the broader galactic community. The people who romanticize it have never worked it. The corridor is dull and expensive, and the coffee is bad, and the transit delays are constant, and the facilities on most of the way station rings are 15 years behind code. The people who lived and worked there were not adventurers. They were professionals. They took their licenses and their certification tests, and they paid their transit fees, and they filed their route applications, and they built small lives at the edge of human commercial reach, because someone had to. And the pay was reasonable, and for some of them it was the life that fit. Human trade arbiters in the corridor were a specific class of licensed intermediary, not soldiers, not diplomats. They were the people who stood between a cargo hold and a customs authority, who spoke the Threni commercial dialect with enough fluency to be useful, who knew which fees were legitimate and which were soft extortion, and how to tell the difference in a way that cost you the least. They held transit licenses issued by both the Bureau and the Threni Syndicate's commercial licensing body. That dual certification was the whole point. It was the legal bridge that made human commerce in the corridor function. Without licensed arbiters, every human freighter at every Threni way station inspection ring was flying blind, subject to arbitrary delays, improper seizure, the full creative latitude of Threni enforcement officers who were not known for their restraint. There were, at the height of the program's operation, roughly 2,000 active licensed human arbiters working the outer corridor. I know the number precisely because I was one of them. Past tense. I held a transit arbiter's license from 2244 to 2261 when I transitioned to a coordination role at the Bureau, 17 years in the lanes. I knew Marat Asen for most of them. He had been working the corridor since 2239, before I arrived, and he was still working it when I moved to the desk job. And when I heard about the navigational anomaly that took his shuttle, I remember thinking that it was the kind of death that happened to corridor people. The equipment failures, the uncharted debris fields, the sensor ghosts that led a pilot into a transit lane rated for Class 4 vessels when they were flying a Class 2. It happened. It was a terrible and unremarkable thing, and I filed the condolence report, and I went back to my caseload. The record document that Marat had spent 10 years compiling told a different story. I will not reproduce the full 41 pages here. I do not have the stomach for it, and it would not serve the accounting I am trying to make. What I will say is this. Marat Asen had identified, documented, and cross-referenced the systematic targeted killing of licensed human arbiters in the outer corridor by operatives working on behalf of the Threnai Syndicate's Commercial Enforcement Division. Not random violence, not opportunistic crime, a program. He called it, in the document's first paragraph, the most methodical commercial extermination I have encountered in 2 decades of working these lanes. And Marat Asen was not a man who used strong language carelessly. The program had a name inside Threnai Enforcement Communications. He had found it in an intercepted internal directive dated 2233, 5 years before I ever set foot in the corridor, 6 years before the first documented killing. They called it the Severing Protocol. The logic, as best as Marat could reconstruct it from internal documents and the patterns of the kills themselves, was not complicated. The Threnai Syndicate controlled the enforcement apparatus of the outer corridor's waystation rings. They collected the transit fees, issued the operating licenses, ran the inspection stations. Human commercial presence in the corridor depended entirely on the willingness of Threnai enforcement to honor those dual certification licenses and let human arbiters do their work. The syndicate had determined, at some point in the early 2230s, that human commerce in the corridor was growing at a rate that would, within 2 or 3 generations, constitute a structural challenge to Threnai market dominance in the lane network. The licensed arbiters were the load-bearing element of that commercial architecture. Remove the arbiters, and human commerce in the corridor collapsed, not dramatically, not with any single visible act of war, but quietly, case by case, shuttle by shuttle, navigational anomaly by navigational anomaly, until the lane network was theirs again, and no one on the human side could quite articulate why it had happened. They had been running this program for 6 years before Marat noticed the pattern. He noticed it because he kept records. That is what I want to say about Marat Asen. He kept records the way some people breathe, not because anyone asked him to, not because it was required by his license, but because he believed that an accurate account of things was itself a form of resistance against the entropy of events, against the tendency of facts to dissolve into the general noise of commerce and incident reports and navigational anomaly filings. He had a list. He kept it current. He cross-referenced every accident in the corridor against the licensing records of the individuals involved, against the route data, against the Threnai enforcement traffic in the lanes at the time of the incident. He built his case over a decade the way a geologist reads strata, patiently, incrementally, without any certainty that the conclusion he suspected was the one he would reach. By the time he finished, the file contained 467 names. I sat with Commander Solvings for 3 hours that afternoon. We read the record document together in silence. Midway through, she got up and locked the office door. At the end, she closed the drive file and placed both her hands flat on the table and looked at them for a long time. She said, "How did he get these communications?" I said, I don't know, he doesn't say. She said, we need to know if this is complete. I said, I think he thought it was complete. He says at the end of the document that he believes the program concluded approximately 18 months before the date of that last write, that the final arbiter on their list was killed in 2257, and that after that date there were no further Threnai enforcement actions of the same signature. He believes they finished. She said, because there was no one left. I said, because the list ran out. We sat with that for a while. Then Solvings picked up the drive, placed it in her jacket pocket, and told me she was going to make some calls and that I was to go back to my quarters and speak to no one about what I had found. She was not unkind when she said it. She was simply a person who understood that the weight of a thing changes the moment it stops being private, and this particular weight needed to be carried carefully until someone with the authority to act on it was holding it. I went back to my quarters and did not sleep. The Bureau's investigation took 14 months. I will compress that time because I lived it, and because the compression is not dishonest. 14 months of document authentication, cryptographic analysis, cross-referencing of transit records, and quiet interviews with surviving family members of the documented dead is not something that yields much in the way of drama. It yields certainty. That is its own kind of weight. But I want to say something about what that certainty felt like to accumulate, because it was not a single arriving revelation. It was a slow accretion, one confirmed case after another, each one a small closure and a small wound opening alongside it. The investigation team was 9 people. I was not formally part of the team. My role was coordination, the management of incoming records requests, the maintenance of the working archive on the Bureau's secure server. But I sat in on every summary briefing, and I watched the confidence metrics on each documented case move from preliminary to substantiated to confirmed, and I understood with each increment what confirmation meant for the person at the center of it. Case 7 in the archive was an arbiter named Selene Varro, who had worked the corridor's eastern transit segments since 2241. She had specialized in agricultural commodity routing, a narrow and technically demanding niche, because the phytosanitary certification requirements for food-grade cargo transiting Threnai inspection rings were labyrinthine, and most arbiters avoided that sector of commercial work because the certification disputes were constant, and the pay differential did not justify the expertise required. Varro had developed a reputation over her years in the eastern segments as someone who could move a blocked agricultural shipment through a Threnai inspection dispute faster than anyone else in the licensed arbiter community. Her shuttle had gone down in 2242, 1 year into the protocol's operational period. The incident report, filed by Threnai Enforcement, cited a cascade failure in her navigation system attributed to a solar event in the transit lane. The investigation team's cross-referencing established that the solar event cited in the report had not occurred. The solar activity data for that lane segment on that date was archived in 3 separate independent monitoring databases, none of which showed any activity consistent with the magnitude claimed in the Threnai incident report. The enforcement vessel listed as the first responder to Varro's crash site was, when its route logs were obtained through the investigation's formal access requests, in a different transit segment entirely on the date in question. A detail the syndicate had apparently not anticipated would be verifiable. I remember the morning that case summary was distributed in the briefing. The lead analyst presented it in the same even register she used for every summary, findings, methodology, confidence interval. The room was quiet when she finished. Someone asked a procedural question about the evidentiary chain. The meeting moved on. I thought about Selene Varro and her agricultural certifications for the rest of that day. What the investigation confirmed. 467 licensed human arbiters had been killed by Threnai Syndicate operatives in the outer corridor between 2239 and 2257. The kills were staged as navigational accidents, equipment failures, and criminal incidents attributed to unaffiliated parties. In 112 cases, the Threnai Syndicate's own enforcement division had filed the incident report with the Bureau expressing formal condolences. In 43 cases, Threnai enforcement personnel had been the first responders to the staged scenes and had assisted in the recovery of remains. 43 cases. I hold that number separately from the others because there is something particular about it. The willingness to stand over the thing you have done and issue condolences to the institution you are deceiving, to perform the role of concerned party while the cooling records of your communications sit in an encrypted partition on a dead man's drive. It requires a specific kind of confidence. The confidence that no one will look, that no one is looking, that the account will never come due. Merritt Osson was the 468th. The investigation confirmed this separately. He had been identified as a surveillance risk in Threnai internal communications 3 years before his shuttle went down. The navigational anomaly was induced. A Threnai enforcement vessel had been in the lane at the time of the incident, running silent, and its wake profile matched the distortion pattern recorded in Merritt's shuttle's final telemetry data. He had found the records. They had found him finding them. And still he had kept building the file, kept updating the partition, because he understood that he was not going to outrun them, and that the only thing he could do that would matter after he was gone was make certain the record survived him. When the investigation's lead analyst presented the authentication summary to the bureau director, the room was quiet for a long time. The analyst said the confidence interval on the attribution was 97.4%. She said this matter-of-factly, in the way that people in her role had been trained to present findings, and she then placed the final summary document on the table and stepped back. The bureau director looked at the document for a moment. She did not open it. She already knew what was in it. She said, "Who else has this?" The analyst said, "The 6 people in this room, the investigation team, and Davin Reyes." The director said, "Who is Davin Reyes?" Commander Solvin said, "The coordination officer who found the archive." The director said, "Where are they now?" Solvin said, "Selin Station, waiting." The director said, "Get them here." I was on Selin Station when the recall came, sitting in the same outer office where I had found the partition, which I had been unable to bring myself to leave in the 14 months since. I had told myself it was professional commitment. There was coordination work to do. The Bureau's investigation needed a local contact. Someone had to keep the office functioning, but the truth was simpler than that. I did not know how to be somewhere else while the accounting was being prepared. The arbiters whose names were in Merritt's file had worked these lanes. Some of them I had known, not many. The corridor is large, and the community of licensed arbiters had been, before the severing protocol, a diffuse one. People encountered each other at way station rings, at the Bureau's regional licensing offices, at the occasional professional coordination meeting. You knew people by name and license number and the routes they ran. You knew their professional reputations. 48 of the 467 I had met in person. 14 of them I had worked alongside on the same way station ring for periods of weeks or months. One of them an arbiter named Caro Lind, who had specialized in the northern transit segments, and who I had met 3 times at licensing coordination meetings, and who had a habit of bringing his own coffee to those meetings because the Bureau's supply was, as he once put it, an insult to the concept of mourning. I had last spoken to in 2251, 4 years before his death. His shuttle had gone down in a navigation anomaly in 2255. I had heard about it through the community communication channel that licensed arbiters used to pass along professional news, and I had noted it and felt the specific low-grade grief that attaches to the death of someone you respect but do not know intimately, and I had moved on. The investigation confirmed that Caro Lind's shuttle had been intercepted by a Threnai enforcement vessel running silent in his transit lane, and that the anomaly in his navigation system had been externally induced. The mechanism was technical, and I will not reproduce it here because I am not the right person to explain it, and because the mechanism is less important than the fact of it. I am not going to enumerate them here. The record will stand on its own, and my particular grief is not the subject of this account. What I will say is that the recall message from Solvin said, simply, "The director wants you in person," and that I understood from the phrasing, its brevity, its directness, its absence of administrative procedural language, that the accounting was moving into a new phase. I boarded the first available transit out of Selin Station that evening. The Bureau's central facility is on Rhea Platform, a mid-sized deep space installation 3 transit days from Selin. I have made that transit dozens of times in my career. I remember almost nothing of those 3 days. I ate and slept and watched the transit lane markers pass the viewport and thought about Merritt Ossen in the years after I had moved to the desk job. The occasional communications, the professional updates, the once-a-year coordination call where we compared caseloads and route conditions, and I would ask how the lane traffic was running in his sector, and he would tell me, in his measured, unsentimental way, what the Threnai inspection delays were averaging that quarter. I had noticed, toward the end, that he had stopped talking about specific colleagues in the lanes. I had attributed this to normal professional drift. The turnover in licensed arbiter positions had always been high. People moved on, retired, transferred. It had not occurred to me that the silence had a different explanation. When I arrived at Rhea Platform, Solvins met me at the docking collar and walked me directly to the director's conference room without stopping for anything. The director's name was Mona Ivars. She was a tall woman, somewhere in her late 50s, who had the specific quality of stillness that belongs to people who have spent decades making decisions with incomplete information and who have learned not to fill the space of uncertainty with motion. She shook my hand when I came in. She asked me to sit. There were 4 other people in the room. 2 I recognized from Solvins's earlier briefings as senior bureau officials. 2 I did not recognize, who I later learned were representatives from Earth Consolidated Command, the joint military diplomatic authority that holds operational responsibility for human security interests outside Earth-licensed space. Ivars said, "You're the one who found it." I said, "Yes." She said, "Tell me what it felt like when you opened the partition." It was not the question I had expected. I thought about it. I said, "I felt like someone had handed me a weight they had been carrying for a long time, and I understood that carrying it was now my job." She nodded slowly. She said, "That's what I needed to know." She looked at the 2 people I didn't recognize and something passed between them. A communication of some kind, wordless, the compressed shorthand of people who have already made a decision and are verifying that the last piece of it is in the room. Then she told me what Earth Consolidated Command was preparing. I want to describe the Cascading judgment accurately, because there has been a tendency in the accounts I have read since, the official ones, the journalistic ones, the retrospectives that have been written in the years following to describe it in terms of scale alone, to make the scale the story, to reduce it to numbers. 380 warships, 19 days, 41 Threnai Syndicate commercial and enforcement installations in the outer corridor addressed. The numbers are accurate and the numbers matter, but they are not the whole account. What the numbers do not capture is the preparation. Earth Consolidated Command had been aware, in a general sense, for some time before Merritt's archive surfaced, that human commercial losses in the outer corridor were running at a statistically anomalous rate. The Bureau's own actuarial models had flagged the pattern years earlier and produced a range of explanatory hypotheses: corridor infrastructure deterioration, increased equipment age in the licensed shuttle fleet, the impact of degraded navigation data in the outer lane segments. These explanations were unsatisfying but not implausible, and the truth is that the institutions responsible for the corridor did not look hard at the anomaly, because looking hard at the anomaly risked finding an answer that required a response they were not ready to give. This is not a flattering admission. I make it because Marit Assen did not flinch from difficult conclusions in his record document, and I will not flinch from them here. What Marit's archive provided was not new data. It was the account that the data had been waiting for. It named the pattern, it named the actors, it named the mechanism, and it was authenticated to a confidence interval that left no operational ambiguity. Earth Consolidated Command could not look at that archive and reach any conclusion other than the one they reached. The Threnai Syndicate had run a 28-year program of targeted homicide against licensed human intermediaries, had filed incident reports over the bodies of the people they killed, and had finished the program when the list ran out. Not because they were discovered, not because they stopped, but because they considered the account settled and the human commercial presence in the corridor effectively neutralized. The command's position, when I sat in that conference room and Director Ivars laid it out with the unhurried precision of someone who had been rehearsing the framing for some time, was this: the syndicate had not committed an act of war in any single moment. They had committed 468 acts of murder over 28 years, camouflaged as commercial attrition. The appropriate response was not one that matched their scale. It was one that matched the totality of their account. She said, "They ran the numbers for 28 years. We have run our numbers." I said, "What do you need from me?" She said, "We need a witness. Someone who worked those lanes, who knew what those arbiters did and how they lived, who found the record and understands what it represents. The Cascading judgment is a military operation. It does not require a civilian observer, but we believe that the record of this response should carry the testimony of someone who was part of the community that was taken from." I said, "You want me on the command ship?" She said, "We want you on the command ship." I said, "All right." I did not need to think about it. Marit Assen had kept the record so it would survive him. The least I could do was ride with the response. The Cascading judgment assembled at a staging point designated Sector Reference 7 Varus, which is a volume of open space approximately 4 transit hours from the nearest Threnai way station ring. I arrived on the command ship, the ECS provisional account, 11 days before the operation's commencement. I had been told I would have a berth in the observer section and access to the bridge during the operational period, and that I was to produce an account of the operation for the Bureau's formal record. This was my function. I did not carry a weapon. I did not hold a rank. I was there to watch and to write, and to carry the weight of the 468 names into a space where the weight of them would finally matter operationally. I want to describe what it is to stand in the assembly area of a fleet that size before an operation begins. I have tried to find a comparison from my years in the corridor, and I cannot. The closest I can get is the feeling of standing on a way station ring during peak transit season, when the docking queues stretch to the edge of scanner range, and the lane markers are layered 6 vessels deep, and you understand that the machine you are standing inside is incomprehensibly larger than any single human perspective can hold. That is scale as commerce. This was scale as decision. 380 warships. The ECS provisional account was the fleet's lead vessel, a heavy command dreadnought whose hull had the particular weathered look of a ship that had been maintained to exacting standards for a very long time. Every weld seam clean, every sensor array calibrated, the anti-debris plating worn smooth in patterns that spoke to years of operational deployment. From the bridge viewports, the fleet's formation was visible only partially, the nearest ships in tight configuration. And behind them, the formation extending in depth and width, until it resolved into a haze of running light constellations and hull silhouettes against the transit lane backdrop. In those 11 days before the operation opened, I spent a good deal of time with the fleet's operations documentation. Wren had given me access to the target assessment files, not the classified operational planning, but the evidentiary basis for each of the 41 designated targets. I read through all 41. Each one was a separate document, built on the foundation of Merritt's archive and the Bureau investigation's additional findings, and each one established, with the same level of specificity that the investigation had applied to the individual death cases, the operational connection between that installation and the protocol's execution. The documents were dry reading. They were meant to be. The language of target assessment files is the language of administrative certainty, finding, cross-reference, confidence interval, supporting evidence, conclusion. No adjectives that weren't necessary. No phrasing that was not load-bearing. I read them slowly, one per evening, and what I found in them was not drama but a kind of grim precision that I recognized from Merritt's record document. The same quality of attention. The same refusal to reach beyond what the evidence would support. The Bureau and Command had built their response on his foundation, and the foundation held. On the 8th evening, I asked one of the operations officers, a young woman named Tevra who had been assigned as my primary contact during the staging period, whether the fleet's crews had been told the full background of the operation. She said yes. She said that in the first briefing after the fleet assembled, Wren had read a summary of Merritt's record document to the entire command staff and had made the full text available in the fleet's secure documentation archive for any crew member who wanted to read it. She said that a substantial portion of the crew had done so. I said, was there any difficulty with that, the weight of it? She said, some. There were quiet days, but the Admiral said something at the end of the briefing that I think helped. She said that the people in Merritt's archive had not been given the choice about whether to be part of what happened to them. The fleet had been given the choice about whether to be part of what happened next. She said, that is a privilege. Use it correctly. I said, that's a good line. Tevra said, she's a good commander. Fleet Admiral Kasia Wren came to find me on the first morning. She was a compact, gray-haired woman who moved through the bridge with the unhurried authority of someone who has been in command of large things for long enough that the size no longer registers as weight. She sat across from me in the observer alcove and asked me, without preamble, whether I had reviewed the operation's target schedule. I said yes. She said, do you have questions about it? I said, 1. What is the selection criterion for the 41 targets? She said, direct operational involvement in the severing protocol, the enforcement installations that process the staged incident reports, the commercial hubs that receive the Arbiters' seized assets after the kills were documented, the licensed enforcement vessels whose wake profiles match the telemetry data from documented incidents. We are not striking Threnai civilian infrastructure. We are not striking Threnai governmental installations that had no documented operational link to the protocol. We went through the archive with the same care Asen used to build it. I said he would have appreciated that. She said, I know. I read the record document. There was a pause. She said, we found something in the archive that wasn't in the summary the Bureau gave us, a notation in the appendix. He wrote it in plain language, which he almost never did. Most of the document is in his professional shorthand. The notation said, I do not expect to finish this in time. I expect someone else to finish it. I am leaving the record for them. I said nothing. I had not seen that notation. She said, he was writing to you. I said, he didn't know I would be the one who found it. She said, no, he was writing to whoever found it, but it turned out to be you. She stood up. She said, the operation begins in 11 days. You're welcome on the bridge at any point. If the observation is difficult at any moment, the observer alcove is shielded from the primary operations screens. No one will think less of you for stepping back. I said, I won't step back. She looked at me for a moment. She said, I didn't think you would. She walked back toward the command station. The Cascading judgment opened at 600 standard on the 11th day. I was on the bridge. I had been there since 400, which was when the final operational briefing concluded, and the fleet shifted from staging configuration to approach formation. I want to be careful here about the language of what I am about to describe, because the language of military operations tends toward either clinical abstraction or dramatic inflation, and neither serves the account I am trying to make. What happened in the first 3 hours was this. The fleet separated into 11 operational strike groups, each assigned a specific set of scifi enforcement and commercial targets within the corridor's way station network. The groups moved simultaneously, on pre-calculated approach vectors that had been designed to minimize the window between the first strike group making contact with its targets and the last. The design principle, as Fleet Admiral Wren explained it to me in the briefing, was to eliminate the possibility of any single target using the time before the cascading judgment's arrival to relocate assets, destroy records, or alert other parts of the syndicate's network in a way that would complicate the operation's completeness. The first and last strike groups would make contact within 40 minutes of each other. I watched the bridge screens as the strike groups resolved into individual vessel formations on the tactical overlay, each group moving with the specific unhurried precision of something very large that knows exactly where it is going and has planned for every contingency, and has no reason to hurry because the account is already prepared, and the only remaining task is to deliver it. The first contact report came in at 6:43. It was from Strike Group 7, the southernmost in the lane network, which had reached a scifi commercial way station ring at the edge of the corridor designated TCS Outer 44. The ring held 3 enforcement vessels, a commercial licensing office, a cargo seizure warehouse, and a communications relay station. All 5 had been on the documented list. TCS Outer 44 was one of the primary processing hubs through which the staged incident reports had been rooted in the protocol's early years. The strike group's report was 2 sentences. It said, "Contact made, TCS Outer 44 addressed." By 7:21, all 11 strike groups had made initial contact with their assigned targets. The contact reports arrived on the bridge with a regularity that I found difficult to describe at the time, and that I have not found easier to describe in the years since. There was no fanfare. There was no announcement. Each report arrived as a brief notation on the tactical board, and the operations officer logged them and the board updated, and the bridge crew went about their work with the focused, quiet professionalism of people executing a plan that was proceeding as planned. Wren stood at the primary command station for most of the first day. She did not pace. She answered questions from the operations staff in brief, precise exchanges. She reviewed incoming intelligence on scifi response postures in the corridor. The syndicate's enforcement vessels outside the targeted installations were, by the second hour, transmitting emergency signals that the fleet's signals intelligence team was monitoring and categorizing. She adjusted the approach angle of Strike Group 2 to account for a scifi enforcement cluster that had moved into the transit lane ahead of the group's assigned vector. The adjustment added 11 minutes to that group's timeline. She authorized it without discussion. On the second day, the scifi syndicate's governance body transmitted a diplomatic communication to Earth Consolidated Command. It was received at 1417 Standard and routed to the Observer alcove, where I was reviewing the Bureau's casualty documentation from Merritt's archive. An operations officer delivered the printed transcript. The communication described the cascading judgment as a disproportionate action against a commercial governance entity, and demanded an immediate cessation of hostilities and the commencement of mediated diplomatic engagement. I read it twice. I set it down. The operations officer said, "Is there anything you want to add to the observation record about the communication?" I said, "Log the receipt. Note the time. Note that no response was transmitted." She said, "Already logged." I said, "Then no, nothing to add." She took the transcript and went back to her station. There was nothing to add. The scifi syndicate had spent 28 years processing, in their own internal communications, the staged incident reports of 468 human deaths. They had filed condolences with the Bureau over the bodies of the people they killed. They had transmitted, on 43 separate occasions, formal expressions of cooperation with the Bureau's investigations into navigational accidents that they had caused. The concept of a diplomatic communication at this juncture was not a concept the Cascading judgment was equipped to engage with, and not because the fleet was incapable of restraint. Restraint was the whole architecture of the operation. The 41 targets had been selected with specificity. The operation would not be widened. No unanticipated force would be applied. The account had been prepared precisely, and it was being delivered precisely, and there was simply nothing in the grammar of that precision that created space for a diplomatic response to a party that had spent 28 years denying the account existed. On day 6, I asked Tevra, the operations officer assigned as my contact, whether the fleet's signals intelligence team was tracking anything unusual in the Threni enforcement network's internal communications. She checked with her counterpart in signals and reported back that the syndicate's enforcement traffic had dropped substantially since day 2. Not encrypted, not redirected, simply reduced. The enforcement vessels that were not on the targeted list were holding position, running minimal communications traffic, and not moving to reinforce or assist any of the targeted installations. I said, "They're watching." She said, "That's the signals team's assessment, yes." I said, "Do you know why?" She thought about it. She said, "Our targeting was specific. The non-targeted installations know they're not on the list, but they also know the list was specific, that it was built on something. They know there's a record. They don't know how complete it is." I understood what she meant. The syndicate's enforcement apparatus operated on the same principle that had made the protocol seem safe for 28 years, the assumption that the account would never become someone else's evidence. The Cascading judgment had not only delivered the accounting, it had demonstrated that the record existed, that it was complete enough to build 41 specific target designations, and that there were parties on the human side who had read it carefully and acted on it. The non-targeted installations were doing what any rational actor does when confronted with the sudden realization that they have been operating inside a comprehensive record. They were being very still and very quiet, and hoping that stillness and quiet had some protective value. It did not in this case, but the Cascading judgment had not been designed to address the whole of the syndicate's enforcement apparatus, only the part of it that the record could reach. Wren had been explicit about this in the briefing. The operation scope was the evidentiary scope, not wider. The discipline of that limit was itself part of the message. The days that followed had a rhythm that I had not anticipated. I had expected urgency, or the electric quality of sustained crisis, or something that resembled the operational tempo I had encountered during the Bureau's more intensive field coordination periods. What I found instead was a kind of measured seriousness, a quality of attention that never relaxed but also never accelerated into strain. The fleet was very large and the targets were specific, and the plan had been built on Marit Ossen's archive, and on 14 months of additional investigation, and on years of capability development, and it was proceeding. On day 4, Strike Group 3 reached the Threni Syndicate's primary commercial licensing hub in the mid-corridor. The installation that had issued, canceled, and reissued Arbiter transit licenses for the entire Central Lane network for the duration of the protocol's operation. This was the administrative center from which the dual certification licenses of the Arbiters listed in Marit's file had been managed. The installation had also housed the protocol's central coordination office in its early years. According to documents, the Bureau's investigation had authenticated from the archive. The contact report from Strike Group 3 was longer than the others. It included a note from the group's commanding officer which read, "Records archive secured before strike, per command directive. Bureau authentication team on site. Contents being logged for transfer." I was told about this notation before it reached the bridge tactical board. Wren sent an operations officer to find me in the observer alcove. The officer said, "The Admiral thought you should know." I said, "Know what specifically?" He said, "The licensing hub had its own records archive. The syndicate had maintained internal documentation of the dual certification license management for the entire protocol period. Their records of what they did." I said, "They kept records of it?" He said, "Apparently so, comprehensive ones." I sat with that for a moment. The particular confidence required to maintain comprehensive internal records of a homicide program spanning 28 years is not the confidence of people who expect to be caught. It is the confidence of people who believe that the account will never leave the room, because the room is theirs and no one on the outside is looking. They had kept their own record because they believed it would never be anyone's evidence. I said, "Make sure the Bureau authentication team gets everything." He said, "The Admiral has already issued the directive." I said, "Tell her thank you." He said, "I will." On day 9, I received a request from the ECS Provisional Accounts Communications Officer. He asked whether I would be willing to speak briefly to the fleet-wide address system. He said that Fleet Admiral Wren had approved the request and that it was entirely voluntary and that no one expected me to have anything prepared. I asked what he had in mind. He said, "A lot of the people in this fleet have read the summary of the archive. They know the name Merritt Ossen. A few of them know yours. Some of them came from civilian backgrounds before they enlisted. There are former commercial professionals in the crew, people who knew what arbiter work in the corridor was." He paused. He said, "It's not a ceremony. There's no good time for something like that in the middle of an operation." But the Admiral felt, and I agreed, that it would be appropriate for the fleet to hear from someone who was there, in the lanes, before. I said, "All right." That evening I stood at a communications terminal and spoke for about 4 minutes. I did not prepare remarks. I said what I knew, which was this. Merritt Ossen worked the outer corridor for 28 years. He was a licensed arbiter, which means he was a professional translator between two commercial systems that did not naturally understand each other. And he was very good at his job. And the people who worked alongside him over those years trusted his judgment and his records and his ability to see a problem clearly and name it without flinching from what the name implied. He kept a list. He kept it for 10 years after he first identified the pattern, and he built the case carefully enough that 14 months of investigation by a bureau team with access to the full range of official authentication tools could not find a single significant error in his documentation. He left the archive in a partition labeled contingency, unassigned, because he understood that he was not going to make it out of the corridor himself, and that the only thing left to him was to make certain the record survived. He was 468 on a list he had spent a decade building. He knew that when he made his last update to the partition. I said, "The 467 people whose names are in that archive before his were professionals. They worked the lanes for the same reasons most people work a job. The pay was fair, the work suited them. Some of them had built small lives in the corridor that they were proud of. They were not soldiers. They did not sign up for a war." The Threnai Syndicate decided, 28 years ago, that human commercial presence in the outer corridor was a problem to be eliminated, and they eliminated it one person at a time. And they filed condolences over the incident reports, and they believed the account was closed. I said the account was not closed, it was waiting. Then I signed off and went back to the observer alcove and sat in the dark for a while. The Cascading judgment completed its primary operational phase on day 14. All 41 designated targets in the outer corridor had been addressed. The fleet strike groups began their consolidation, moving back toward the staging reference point at Sector Reference 7 Varus in the same measured formation they had arrived in. The secondary operational phase was administrative. The Bureau authentication teams embedded with each strike group had secured records from 7 of the 41 targets, records that the command's legal division would need for the formal accounting that would follow the operation. This phase ran for an additional 5 days. I spent most of those 5 days in the observer alcove working on this document. On the 17th day, I received a message from Director Ivars at the Bureau. It was brief. It said that the Bureau's Casualty Records Division had completed the formal documentation of the 468 deaths, assigning each a case status of confirmed homicide attributed, and that the documentation would be entered into the Permanent Bureau record under the designation Operation Record, which was the name Marit Assen had given to his archive. I wrote back and said that I thought the name was appropriate. She wrote back and said she agreed. On the 19th day, Fleet Admiral Wren called me to the bridge. The fleet was in final consolidation formation, the strike groups having rejoined the main body, and the tactical board showed a clean configuration, 380 vessels moving in coherent formation through open space. She pointed at the board. She said, "That's the full count. All groups accounted for." I said, "What happens now?" She said, "The fleet disperses to its home installations over the next several weeks. The Bureau's administrative process runs. Earth Consolidated Command files its formal account with the relevant interstellar governance bodies. The notification that the Cascading judgment was conducted, its scope, its basis, and the documentation of the record that prompted it. No party will be under any ambiguity about what the account consisted of or why it was prepared." I said, "And the Threnai Syndicate?" She said, "They have 41 fewer installations in the outer corridor than they did 19 days ago. Their commercial licensing authority in the corridor is effectively terminated. Their enforcement capacity in the lane network has been substantially reduced. The Bureau will be reissuing Arbiter transit licenses under a new bilateral framework, with the remaining commercial powers in the corridor that does not require syndicate co-signature." I said, "Marit spent 28 years watching them build something, and 11 days give or take." She said, "Give or take." We were quiet for a moment. Outside the viewports, the corridor's outer lane markers were visible in the distance. The faint geometric precision of the way station network's navigational infrastructure, the physical skeleton of the commercial system that the Arbiters had worked, and that the protocol had spent 28 years trying to dismantle. I said, "Can I ask you something?" She said, "Yes." I said, "When did you make the decision that the response had to be at this scale?" She looked at the tactical board for a moment. She said, "The decision wasn't mine. I commanded the operation. The decision to prepare the Cascading judgment at the scale it was prepared, 380 vessels, all 41 targets, the full scope. That decision was made by people with the authority to make it, and it was made on the basis of what Marit Assen's archive established. 28 years, 468 people. A program designed to run until there was no one left to run it against." She paused. She said, "The syndicate made a calculation about what human commercial presence in the corridor was worth and what the cost of eliminating it would be. They ran that calculation for 28 years. The Cascading judgment was our version of the same calculation, run forward from the same data." She looked at me. She said, "They finished their account. We finished ours." I had nothing to add to that. I am writing this final section on the transit back to Selin Station. I will file the completed account with the Bureau's Permanent Record Office on arrival, alongside the authentication copies of Marit's archive and the operational record of the Cascading judgment. The full documentation will be maintained in perpetuity. This is not a figurative commitment. The Bureau's permanent record is not a digital archive subject to administrative review cycles and budget constraints. It is a physical and redundant institutional record, maintained across multiple installations, because the Bureau learned some time ago that the worst thing that can happen to an account of the dead is for it to become inaccessible. I have spent a good part of this transit thinking about a specific question that I have not been able to answer to my own satisfaction, which is whether Merritt knew the scale of what his record would eventually prompt. He was an intelligent man. He understood the commercial and political stakes of what he was documenting. He had worked the corridor long enough to understand the relationship between what the Bureau could do administratively and what Earth Consolidated Command could authorize operationally. He would have known that the record, if authenticated and acted upon, would constitute a basis for a response at scale. He built the record to that standard deliberately. But knowing the basis and knowing the response are different things. I think about this because the record document itself is not a document of rage. It does not call for anything. It does not recommend. It identifies, it documents, it authenticates, and it stops there, at the edge of its own evidentiary competence. Merritt was too precise a thinker to reach past what his evidence could support into the territory of prescription. He trusted the record to speak for itself, and he trusted whoever found it to read it correctly. I do not know whether he imagined 380 warships. I think he imagined something sufficient. I have thought on this transit about what Merritt knew and when he knew it. He had found the pattern by 2248, according to his own dating of the record document. He had another 9 years before the syndicate identified him as a surveillance risk, and 4 years after that before his shuttle went down. In those 13 years, he had full knowledge of what was being done and to whom and by whom, and he continued to work the corridor. He continued to file his route applications and process his caseload and attend his coordination calls, including the ones with me, and he updated the archive and kept the list current, and he did not tell anyone, not because he was protecting himself, but because he understood that telling someone was not the same as telling the right someone at the right moment with the right documentation. He had spent a decade building the case to the standard where it could not be dismissed, and he believed correctly that the standard mattered more than the speed. He was not a soldier. He was not a spy. He was a licensed trade arbiter who kept very good records and understood that accuracy is a form of resistance. There is a specific kind of courage in that, and I want to name it correctly because I think it gets obscured in the scale of what followed. It is not the courage of the battlefield, which at least has the advantage of immediacy, the crisis that demands response, the urgency that narrows the available options, the forward movement that crowds out the space where doubt could live. What Merritt had was the other kind. The courage of the long, quiet, methodical thing, sustained across 13 years, conducted in the lanes and offices and coordination calls of an ordinary professional life, in full knowledge that the people who would eventually find the archive would be finding it because the people who had identified him as a threat had already won their particular calculation about his fate. He kept building the case past the point where he knew he would be alive to see it matter. I have no adequate word for that. I will call it what it was. The most important professional act in the history of the Outer Corridor Arbiter program, conducted without recognition, without backup, and without any certainty that the record would ever reach the people who needed to read it. The 467 people who preceded him on the list did not know they were on a list. They did not have the opportunity to keep a record or to leave one behind. They went to work in the lanes they knew, on the transit routes they ran, and the syndicate's enforcement mechanism moved through those lanes behind them, and the incident reports were filed, and the Bureau received condolences. I know their names, all 467, plus Merritt's. I have read every name in the archive at least once. I have read many of them multiple times, at odd hours on transit, in the observer alcove of the ECS provisional account in the dark between operational phases. I do not think this habit will leave me. I do not think it is supposed to leave me. Someone has to keep the list current even after the accounting is complete, because the accounting does not erase the names from the list. It gives the list its final context, which is the only thing the list was ever missing. Commander Solving sent me a message 2 days into this transit. She said that the Bureau had received 3 separate inquiries from commercial entities based in the outer commercial networks, not Threnai, but neighboring parties who had been watching the corridor's lane network, about the Bureau's timeline for reissuing Arbiter transit licenses under the new bilateral framework. She said the inquiries were professional and reasonable, and that the Bureau was preparing its response. She said, "We may need you back in the lanes eventually, if you want to go back." I wrote back and said I would think about it. I am still thinking about it. The corridor is not a romantic place. I know that as well as anyone who has spent 17 years working it. But the work was real, and the people who did it were real, and there is something that feels unfinished about allowing the protocol to be the last word on what human commercial presence in the lanes means. The cascading judgment addressed the specific account. What comes after it is the question of what we build in the space. The protocol spent 28 years trying to clear. That is someone else's problem for today. Today I am on transit, and I am finishing this document, and I am thinking about Merritt Ossen and his filing system and the word contingency in a subfolder that no one else thought to open. He was right that someone would find it. He was right that the record was sufficient. He was right in the record document's final paragraph in plain language about what the account would be used for. Merritt Ossen wrote, in the final paragraph of the record document, in the same plain language as the appendix notation that Fleet Admiral Wren had found, and that I had missed this. I do not know who will read this. I know someone will. I have built this record on that assumption. The Threnai Syndicate has spent 28 years treating human lives in the outer corridor as a commercial externality, a line item to be managed toward a particular balance. They believe the balance has been achieved. They are wrong about what balance means. I am leaving this record for the person who will explain to them what the word means. I found the archive. I rode with the fleet. I wrote the account. The balance has been explained.